he said, it was like the news of the world. This is trivial stuff and you're making a huge thing out of this. And I argued my case, and in the end he said, look, son, you're a PC. I'm the detective chief superintendent. So I said, thank you very much, sir, and left it like that. 2 days later, my office door bursts open as a CID officer from upstairs comes down and says, who's this bloke, blah, 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 who lives on the ground? We don't know him. And I said, well, I do. I said, why do you want to know? Well, apparently he's kidnapped a woman in Clapham, and you're the only one that seems to know anything about it. So I said, well, he lives around the corner, blah, blah. And they put it all together, and eventually, cut a long story short, he was nicked for kidnapping. And so the station that was dealing with him, someone in the office there rang me up and said, that was bloody good, mate.
Hello, everybody. Welcome back to the pod. If you want to find something out these days, the chances are you're probably going to grab your phone. You're probably going to Google it. You're probably going to, because the internet provides answers to all of our questions these days. But as many of our listeners will remember, there was a time before Google and the internet. There was a time before computers at all, and where we had to rely on paper-based record systems and things written down or printed. So if you cast your mind back to the late 60s across London, many of the police stations, if not all, had a very special kind of office. The office was known as the Collators Office, and the people who worked there were known as collators. They maintained physical records, card index systems, and various other kind of physical records and data that would enable police investigations and intelligence operations without any form of computer whatsoever. And many police officers would walk into the collator's office to basically ask the collator what they knew about a certain given topic. Now, some collators were like librarians, essentially custodians of the data, just maintaining the card indexes and making things were just ticking over. Some of the collators weren't. Some of the collators were very proactive. Some were even known to go out on a lunchtime and arrest the odd villain. And we are very lucky to have one such collator with us today. I'd like to introduce David Allen, former Metropolitan Police officer for many years, half of his career in essentially uniform operations, but also a collator for many years as well. So welcome to the podcast, David.
Thank you very much.
So David, just for our listeners, could you maybe just start at the very beginning then and just set the scene by telling us maybe why you got into the police, what it was like joining the Met Police back in then, and then take us from there.
Well, I joined in 1960. It was the only thing I was ever likely to do, as my sister was already a police officer from 1958. My dad had been a copper for 30 years. His father before him, and his father before him. So there were Allens in the Met since 1859. So when my father said to me, "What do you want to do for work?" I said, "I really don't know." He said, "Well, you're good at athletics and football. Why don't you join the cadets? Because you can do a lot of sport." Unfortunately, my eyes weren't quite up to muster, so I didn't get in the cadets. So I joined the civil service for 3 years until coppers were allowed to join with glasses in 1966. By that time, my eyesight had corrected sufficiently so I could join. I joined in 66 because the family had been in the police service, and it was a good career to join. Plus, as my dad kept telling me, get a job with a pension. And I am lucky enough to have been collecting my police pension now for nearly 30 years. So well done, Dad. So yes, I joined in 66, went to training school at Hendon, did 13 weeks there, and then got a posting to C Division right in the middle of London, which consisted of West End Central. There were 2 stations in West End Central 1 and West End Central 2. And then there was Bow Street, which was considered the country station, as it had Covent Garden Market right in the middle of it, which was different to West End Central, which had Mayfair, Bond Street, Park Lane, Piccadilly. And so I went to Bow Street on my own. There were 3 of us posted to C Division. I went to Bow Street on my own. Bit disappointed that I would end up there on my own. But within days, I was asked if I played football. I said, yes, I do. Turn up Thursday morning. You're playing Thursday morning or Thursday afternoon for Bow Street football team. And that way I got to know a lot of the chaps in the football team. And that was my way into the social side of the station. And then I did my 18 months probation, walking the streets. That's all we ever did for the first few years. You walked the beats. Bow Street was the smallest ground in the Met. It was only 3/4 of a mile long from the Strand at Trafalgar Square to the Strand at Fleet Street on the city boundary. And so all we did was walk the streets on beats, and which was interrupted by standing outside like embassies like the Indian High Commission, the South Africa House, and places like that for 4 hours at a time. And then once you pass your probationary period, there were other opportunities, such as learning to drive, which I did. And eventually in 1974, became an advanced car driver. And then for the next 7 or 8 years, I was driving what are now response cars, but were area cars in those days around the West End of London. So that's where I got to. And I was still doing that up until 1981, when, for reasons which I won't bother you with, they were looking for a new collator. The old collator had blotted his copybook and had to be moved to one side, and they were looking for somebody else. And because I was one of the oldest PCs still on the streets and still active, my name came up and the job was offered to me. And as it turned out, it fitted with my family that were growing up. And so I took a 9-to-5 job rather than shift work. But it was the one job that I would have taken out of all the admin jobs, because I was interested in crime and faces in particular. I loved looking at pictures of criminals to see if I could spot them when I was out. I'm still good at faces today. And so I took on the Collators job in 81, and I was there doing the old-fashioned Collators job, which is a card index system, until I was asked. I had a falling out with my chief superintendent, and so I thought, I've had enough of this. And then in 87, I went up to Scotland Yard to work on computers in Method Index, which was a part of the old Criminal Record Office, the old CRO, or NIB as it was when I went up there, National Identification Bureau. But I was in Method Index, a national part of the system, where we would get inquiries from all over the country saying, can you put someone up for this particular method of crime or description or whatever. And I did that for 4 years and enjoyed it. I loved that. We had some brilliant results just from the computer system. And then after 4 years up there, I was invited to go back to Bow Street because they were getting rid of some coppers out of Scotland Yard. And I was invited to go back to Bow Street in 91 and 92. Bow Street and Cannon Row amalgamated to become Charing Cross Police Station. So for the last 5 years of my service, I came back as a crime prevention officer, going out, giving advice to people on burglary or whatever it was, anti-terrorism, credit card fraud, you name it. That was what I did. And then retired in 1997. And then I went from there to the Bank of England as a security officer for 10 years. I loved the job there. The managers were awful, but it was a nice place to be, a lovely place to work. And we had a force of about 120 ex-coppers or ex-military people. So it was like joining the job all over again, until I retired completely in 2007. Here I am now.
Can I just go back to your uniform operational kit prior to the Collators then? What type of villains, you say you're walking streets literally all day. What type of villains were you dealing with? What type of incidents were you having to respond to?
I think what you got to remember is Bow Street is not a place where a lot of people live. So unlike every other police station in the country where you've got domestic burglaries, for example, we never had that, just the odd one. So it was all people that came up to the West End as visitors. They called our area Theatre Land because that's where all the theatres were. And so our victims of crime were women who put their handbags down in pubs, restaurants and bars and get them picked up, or vehicle crime. In those days, you could park in the West End and cars would either get stolen or theft from vehicles. But most of our stuff on the streets, bearing in mind, and I've looked at this differently as I've got older, in the late 60s, there were many, many servicemen, single men who'd gone through the Second World War and who were now vagrants through no fault of their own, whereas these days they would be looked after. All of these old chaps got drink problems, and we dealt with those time and time and time again. And we had a lot of what they used to call common lodging houses, where these single men would sleep for a night for £1 for the bed and that sort of thing. And the other stuff was where you'd get youngsters coming up to the West End for a night out, so you'd get the odd fight and a general disturbances. So at crime, you had to find it. You had to go and look for it. So a lot of it was done just stop and search and see what people had in their pockets, which is what I love to do, because you never know what you're going to find.
Thank you. So did you use the Collators Office a lot in your role operationally prior to you taking over, or?
I did. I used to go in there a lot because I loved looking through things like police gazettes.
What's a police gazette, just for our listeners? Sorry, you got to assume that our listeners do not know anything about policing.
Understood. They were sheets of paper that came out from places like CRO, where people were wanted, and there were pictures of them in there. Because as I said, I loved faces and pictures. I was good at spotting people, and I would flick through these pages and pages just looking at photographs of people, thinking that I may bump into them. And on occasions, I did, rare occasions, but if you've got someone's face in your head and you spot them, you go, I've seen you before. And so yes, I unfortunately, as I think I may have said to you before, the chap before me as the collator he had the job as a sinecure rather than being an active copper. Now, I've been thinking about this since I spoke to you previously, and it reminded me that when the collator's system started at Bow Street or in the Met generally in about 1969-70, it came under A branch at Scotland Yard. Now, A stood for administration, whereas anything to do with crime, CID, was under C department, C for crime. So unfortunately, when the collator system started, it was under the admin department. And so they looked for someone who could do an admin role rather than anything to do with crime. So it was more or less seeing crime sheets come or charge sheets come in, and you just sent them out to wherever they had to go. And then the Criminal Record Office files, CRO files would come through. You do the paperwork there and send them on. So it was considered really as an admin role rather than anything to do with crime. And it was only later, I can't remember when it all changed, and then it came under C department, and in particular C11, which was criminal intelligence, and then it all changed. And then we had access, PCs on the streets then, through the collator, had access to criminal intelligence at the yard, which was a big step forward.
I'm basking in David's memories because they echo and predate my own. And I recognise what you say, David, this progression from it being basically a filing and administrative role, just as a way of dealing with volume of data and processing it, particularly, and I speak as a local copper who was a customer of NIB and CRO and Mancro and all the others throughout my service, to something that suddenly actually involved thief-taking, criminal knowledge, and also other sources of knowledge, whereby I always found that the collators tended to focus on the information that came from the street, from members of the public and from beat officers walking around or desk sergeants. And I don't mean it in a derogatory way, but kind of that low-level kind of information. It would go in what we would call in our intelligence systems the what-if box. You didn't necessarily know it was significant, but it might be, so you'd shove it away in the what-if box and index it however you could. It could be found again. But then that migration from admin to links to police work in terms of investigating crime and other sources of data. Like you say, the link to Scotland Yard. I remember the same in my home force, which was West Yorkshire, a big provincial force. that was exactly the same. It was only when the Collators became part of Force Intelligence, which is where I came across them, that you suddenly saw these links to other data sets from the serious and organised crime elements of the force, those resources being fed into a central pot that the average Joe, the working beat copper, as well as the great and good involved in the most serious and complex crime, could access it. And what really stood out to me at that time, and still does to this day, it always makes me smile about people who they think they own the information and they're the experts on it because they've collected it, they've filed it, and they may be, but they don't have the connective networks or the awareness to look at that same data in the context of other data or of a real life problem that's going on, maybe a terrorist attack or a crime wave or some other issue with multiple occurrences and multiple events. And that for me was the selling point for collation being a service of added value, not just I know where I can go find the stuff filed away, and if I can use my intellect, I might find it, or I'll ask the collator, but where somebody centrally could start joining the dots across all these systems where the bit players in it didn't do. And that applied for me, not just within a force like you describe in the Met, but nationally between forces. I can remember divisional collators officers would be the conduit to go to the force collators. They would sort of be the barrier to say, well, we'll speak to the force collators for you, or to make an inquiry to the Met or some other force. You know, you'd arrived as an investigator, be it in uniform or as a detective, if you were making inquiries about information that was interforce, particularly to the Met, because where the Met led in most things, other forces followed politically. That's just how our system has been, certainly in all my lifetime anyway. You'd arrived, you know, be it uniform or detective, you were an important person. You were working on important things, and you felt that. I can remember the feel-good factor of either creating a piece of information and putting it into a system whereby a collator in another force area would pick it up off, or even from the major crime division or one of the more serious and organised crime elements, investigative elements in my force, and say, we'd like a word with you. We can't tell you why, but will you tell us all about this information? You'd arrived. I remember that I had the same epiphany almost the first time I ever came in contact with Special Branch, which for the uninformed on the podcast, people who don't understand, the police and the security services of the UK, but this is the case in most countries, don't usually have direct contact because we work in different worlds. But there are times when we overlap. And within the police force, the Special Branch is a branch of officers who are, in effect, the liaison points to find the areas of interest and cooperation between those government agencies and what you might call local national law enforcement. And suddenly to contact that and see some of the information that they would provide, which might come from what you might call spies in the conventional sense, would often come from the military assets that were gathering information. It was a real eye-opener as a customer of information. It was like suddenly somebody giving you, instead of eating junk food, you were eating, you know, 5-star Michelin prepared meal by the best chef in the world. And that's what, for me, made information and the information system sexy and worthwhile and of great value more than anything else.
Howard and Ando, I'd like to get your take on this. So I'm reading from an article written by the designer of the Collator system, Neville Spike Hughes, written in an edition of The Peeler, which I think it's an internal magazine for the Met Police Museum. And he writes a very specific piece that I just want to, because I think some of our listeners who are not from a police background may not appreciate this, which is, if you're not from a police background, you watch a lot of TV and you think that policing is a little bit like Sherlock Holmes or like the TV drama where the detective finds this very neat laid out breadcrumb trail of evidence and that gives you the identity or gives you the whereabouts of an offender. But actually in real life, as we three know, it's much more complicated than that. There's usually, you have to put together lots of it. You have to get rid of lots of false information. You have to kind of put the jigsaw together. But something that Spike wrote was, so basically he said that the in the Collators Office, there would be books of all kinds, sales report books, and he would try and collate all of that. As individual pieces of information, they meant very little. But time and time again, a minute piece of apparently useless information was all that was needed to complete what was apparently an unsolvable crime or a series of crimes. Do either of you have any examples of maybe something, just to try and switch the light on, to kind of say, well, how something quite small and innocuous can solve a crime?
Well, yes, I can. I got one. I had a falling out. I didn't fall out with all my senior officers, but on this occasion I did. Because the information, we at Bow Street used to be a charging station. As I said, we didn't have many people living on the ground. But one morning we got a piece of, someone had been charged another station not too far away. And he had lived on Bow Street's ground some years ago. I'd never met him, but I knew of him. And I thought he was an old lag who would never come to light again. And his name turned up on a piece of paper with his old address on. And he'd been nicked for shoplifting elsewhere. And I looked at this, and what had happened, he'd been on a day out to Boulogne in France or somewhere like that, and come back. And as he'd come through customs, I think he'd been found, he had some stolen property on him. Not much. Anyway, he ended up being arrested and charged with shoplifting. And this piece of paper came through to me, and I thought, there's a name that I haven't seen for years, absolute years. And I thought, there's somebody should know about this chap who lives on the ground, who was an old lag. He's still got his fingers in a few pies. And I used to do a daily record, which with everything that would come in, so the blokes could read it on a daily basis. And then at the end of the week, on a Friday, I would normally do a news, what do we call it? A bulletin, a collator's bulletin, which I would send out to everywhere, all the other stations, the yard, you name it. And I decided on this one, because we hadn't seen this chap for years, and because he'd been out of the country and come back after a day in France, I put a big headline, something like "International Fraudsman." And I used to try every trick in the book so that people would read this stuff. And I put in there that this chap who lived on Bow Street's ground had been nicked for shoplifting after coming back into the country. Anyway, I hear a couple of days later that my detective chief inspector called me up, and he said, I've just had a meeting with the detective chief superintendent who read your bulletin and thought it was absolutely outrageous, the style you used. It looked like the news of the world. And for just a shoplifter, come on, mate. I was annoyed at this. So I rang the detective chief superintendent, who's now long dead, and he ended up, I won't give too much away, but he ended up at the yard doing anti-terrorism. And I rang him up and I said, look, can you tell me what you've got against what I did? And he said, it was like the news of the world. This is trivial stuff and you're making a huge thing out of this. And I argued my case, and in the end he said, look, son, you're a PC. I'm the detective chief superintendent. So I said, thank you very much, sir, and left it like that. 2 days later, my office door bursts open as a CID officer from upstairs comes down and says, who's this bloke, blah, 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 who lives on the ground? We don't know him. And I said, well, I do. I said, why do you want to know? Well, apparently he's kidnapped a woman in Clapham, and you're the only one that seems to know anything about it. So I said, well, he lives around the corner, blah, blah. And they put it all together, and eventually, cut a long story short, he was nicked for kidnapping this chap. And so the station that was dealing with him, someone in the office there rang me up and said, that was bloody good, mate. How did you come up with that? And I said, well, just a snippet of information which I thought was worth making a big thing of. And what happened? People put two and two together. Bloody good result. Bloody good result.
And David, this takes me back to something you and I spoke of off air, which is just to put our listeners in the picture. When you started this pod, both you and Howard spoke of like this idea that, okay, the Collators was an administrative function, not crime. It was almost kind of like a back-end function, kind of deprioritized, almost trivialized to a certain extent. You and I spoke off air about how you used to have crime maps in the Collators Office, but you had to put them very high because you couldn't, some people would interfere with your maps basically while you weren't there. And I think it's important to recognise the reason why I'm asking, well, I guess what I'm asking is, I'm guessing you put that headline in because in some ways you were constantly trying to get the attention to an item because there was a degree of like operational cynicism. You were always trying, you've told me about different ways you tried to get the operational police officers engaged. I think you said when you were doing your daily reports, you did other things. I think Howard's had similar experiences of trying to persuade operational police officers of the value of intelligence. And I think sometimes it's hard from a non-police background. You just say, oh, well, you would think that police officers would hang on to every word, but actually the environment you described seemed almost adversarial in a way, or certainly quite combative sometimes.
Well, yes. And as I said to you to start with, it was considered an admin role. And then afterwards, we came under C department, which was crime. My boss, being a uniform PC, which all collators were, because it was then considered something to do with crime eventually, we came under the detective chief inspector, who was up on the second floor with the CID. Now, he didn't want anything to do with a lowly PC downstairs, nothing to do with him at all. So I took advantage of this. I've always had a decent sense of humour, and so I would use my sense of humour to get blokes coming in, reading what I've written. I used to have PCs sitting down. Can I read your daily record, Dave? Yeah. And they'd sit there laughing. And I said, Dave. I said, what are you laughing at? And I said, well, you can't say this about the chief superintendent. I said, well, he doesn't read it. Blokes would have a laugh. But I would try any trick in the book to get blokes to read a bit of information. And occasionally I'd get into a bit of trouble. There was another story because I used to come in of a morning, and very often one of our local villains, youngsters, would have friends on the neighbouring station, which was Holborn. And either we'd nick one of their locals or they'd nick one of ours. So I would ring the collator at Holborn, Chris Foster, and we'd have a chat about who's doing what and what have you, and who's wanted at the moment. And I used to have a bit of banter with him. And in the newsletter or the bulletin at the end of the week, if I could have a pop at him just out of he was an Arsenal supporter and I was a Spurs supporter, I'd throw that in as well, just to get people laughing and reading. Let's read what you've written about so-and-so this week. So I try every trick in the book. And as I say, unfortunately, being under the CID, it should have been under the CID, but unfortunately, because they're upstairs and we're down there, it could have worked better. But it meant that as I was pretty much unsupervised, I'm going to get into trouble here, I could more or less do what I wanted with everything that I had. And as a collator, you would be in charge of prisoners' photographs, because they only came in at a station level, I suppose, in the mid-70s. Up until then, the only photographs that were taken of prisoners were when they came out of prison. So in the mid-70s, we started taking fingerprints and photographs, and it was the collator's job to make sure the photographs were taken, or not that the photographs were taken, because that was up to the PCs who arrested them. But when the photographs came back, you had to make sure that the photographs had the right name on, the right charge number, and you would hope that you didn't see a PC's hand round someone's neck while the photograph was being taken. And then you had the odd photograph of a dog or a dwarf or a clown, and you collected all these up, and you filed them away and didn't let the boss see them. But every so often, if these people who were charged were not convicted, then you had to take all of these photographs up to the boss to say, I'm destroying all these photographs, boss. Is that all right? Oh, Christ. He's like, yeah, sign up. And then I've got a pile of photographs that I should destroy, but I thought some of them, no. It's probably the only photograph of them ever going to get of this bloke. That'll go in the drawer. And also what I did, I had an old camera which I brought from home, because I never knew when I was going to be able to take a photograph of someone when we didn't have a photograph. And on one occasion, we had a pair of twin brothers who were on bail from the court next door, who would come up and sign in at the station at 4:00 in the afternoon, a pair of twin brothers. And we didn't have any photographs of these chaps. So one day I rang the front office. I said, let me know when the two brothers come in. Tell me when they're just going to sign the book. So anyway, they rang me. He said, they're in here now, just going to sign the bail book. And I ran out the front with my camera and I grabbed the PC who was coming in for his cup of tea. And I said, stand there. He said, what are you doing? I said, stand there and have your photograph taken and smile. And as the two chaps came out the door, I took a snap of this PC with the two brothers behind them. Great. I've now got a photograph that I can use if anybody wants it later on. So, I wasn't supervised too closely and you did what you could because you wanted to get a result.
But I think that's the thing, though, isn't it? I think that's the other thing that perhaps non-police listeners might not realise is that sometimes I think people hear about police intelligence and think, are we just adopting the kind of James Bond style intel term? But actually, there is a side to policing that is criminal investigation, but there's a side to policing that is about kind of collecting those jigsaw pieces as best we can and putting that picture together. And sometimes we don't actually have the detail about a specific crime, but we know who the criminals are, right? And sometimes we have to kind of keep an eye on kind of keeping track of them. How is there anything you want to say about that?
Yeah, just a couple of points. Everything that David says makes me smile because it just brings back so many memories. First thing, we are collectors of information. Therefore, you are basically trying to collect the truth of the facts and B, sift it for what might be important to somebody somewhere at some time. So you and I, Mark, have talked about this from an intel in general point of view. We are gatherers and sharers and promoters of information of significance, put it that way. That makes our job inconvenient for most of our customers sometimes because on a personal level they may take offence that we found something they haven't, and the egos of some specialists and senior officers don't like that. Not all. The best are completely the other way. They'll take anything from anywhere and say thank you. I was always like that as an SIO. But secondly, politically or for other personal reasons, it can be inconvenient to an individual, a team, an organisation. So I was always known in the service when I was doing this kind of work as the troublesome priest because I was coming up with important insight, but insight that was often inconvenient. So they wanted to know, but they didn't want it to go public, shall we say, or be more widely shared. They wanted control. And I've never had a real problem of leaving the decision-making to other people. I'd simply present the information and let them make the decisions, because at the end of the day, that's my job with that hat on. I'm not going to be the one making the arrest. I'm not going to be the one taking the flak if it all goes wrong. I'm just standing by my information. So that's the first thing. We're inconvenient. Second thing is, intelligence, like all information sharing, is entertainment. So all David's stories about the bulletins and things, you're absolutely bang on. If you don't entertain, people are not going to read. If they don't read, they don't have the chance to see the significance. So you've got to be almost a prostitute. You've certainly got to be a creative salesperson for things that you think are important. Now, you could be wrong, in which case you're leaving yourself out there to get your ass kicked. And that's fine. You need to be a strong character, but you need to be prepared for that and have a healthy sense of humour about yourself. But secondly, you've got to think about selling it and justifying it. And I'll give you a good example, Mark. When we set up the Yorkshire and Humber Regional Intelligence Unit, at that time, the National Intelligence Model was still the peak production process, courtesy of good old NCIS, the National Criminal Intelligence Service, and the Association of Chief Police Officers Working Committees, of which I was a member. The National Intelligence Model created intelligence products that were designed to be universal. And we've talked about this before. They were boring as hell. A subject profile might be 40, 50 pages. The snippet of information you've got about Howard or David or Mark might only warrant half a page. But the system demanded all these pages filling in. It was like writing a book, and you think, is it really worth it? So not all the information got in, or it got incorrectly put in, so on and so forth. It was corrupted. So it was flawed. So when we set up the Regional Intelligence Unit, we were partnering on the back of force intelligence units as well as other more senior partner intelligence units like the National Crime Squad, special branches from all over, force, other senior forces, military services. But we only got what they want us to have. And in our case, we served for force customers. They weren't going to give us the really sexy stuff because they wanted to be the ones who found it. So we had to focus on low-hanging fruit. So we would go trawling through those 4 forces, intel and information systems, identify low-hanging fruit, and then come up with analysis, intelligence insight as to who's doing what. And one of the things we did, and you were the driver behind this, not me, was create an information package, a presentation package, just like David's broadsheets. And what we produced had a trademark. It was really focused. There wasn't lots of text in it. It was quick and simple points, key players, their importance. Because if you get the attention of senior officers, and we were talking at chief constable, heads of crime level, if you get their attention, they will task other people to ask the awkward questions about the detail. You've got them. You've hooked them. And within what I remember, I mean, we used to produce those monthly as a monthly briefing. And by the second briefing, our main customer force had actually cancelled their force strategic and tactical products that they generated every year and nobody read for the force and adopted our system. It was basically a cut and paste. So it proves David's point about entertainment and almost humour, but tongue-in-cheek humour. Coppers run on humour. You have to do. I've talked about this before. If you haven't got humour, you've got nothing. It's a way of respect, but testing respect. The final thing was about how to get away with insulting managers. I loved that because it's a necessary evil in almost any organisation. We've all had bad managers at every level and bad management processes. But the best one I can remember was a division in Leeds in West Yorkshire, which had, by this point, a local intelligence office rather than a Collators. It become this divisional branch of what was a force-managed process. That was staffed by a uniformed sergeant and a few PCs. There was a nominal DC in there, but there were 2 or 3 very effective civilian ladies who did what you might call the traditional Collators role. And they were the backbone of the office. And they had a system whereby the office had a door with a glass pane in the top. And every now and again, the high and mighty, the divisional commander, the deputy divisional commander, one of the 3 chief inspectors, uniform, CID, community, would stick their head in. But it was kind of the royal visit. They'd come in and make some smart aleck comment and leave. So what the ladies devised was it had a dartboard drawn, and the dartboard face faced outwards. And like all dartboards, it had rings and it had a bullseye. And they then had pictures made, like David talks about pictures, of all the senior officers. And every one of these pictures was on the dartboard. And the closer that picture was to the centre of the dartboard, the greater the offence that they had taken at something that a senior officer had said. Now, like David says, he or I, as uniformed officers or full police officers, could expect to have the backside ripped out of us in no uncertain terms by more senior officers. That's the way of the world. It is what it is. But I can remember smiling and laughing. You would watch these senior officers walk down the corridor to their offices at the other end of the building, past the intelligence office, and they would look at the dartboard and see where their head was. And if it was anywhere near the centre, they wouldn't go in. The point I'm making is those ladies had come up with an effective way of management without insulting them, that they are, pardon my French, idiots. You know what I mean? Or offensive, or they're wrong. And speaking truth to power is the important function, I think, of intelligence and information systems, be that in law enforcement or in the private sector, but in law enforcement particularly, because it matters. That's why when I look now at some of the information systems that are serving our decision makers globally, you cry, because the quality of that, what they're putting out, is not based in fact. It's based in part on, I won't say wokeness, but something it has attributes nothing to do with the actual facts. It becomes for a different purpose, to look good or tick a box or to please some particular customer of that product. If your products are pleasing customers, you're not making good products. Your products should make customers sit up and be very worried, but thankful that you've let them know about something that's about to catch them out, or be very grateful after the fact, but not comfortable. Any senior law enforcement officer who sits back thinking, I've got control of my world, there's nothing going on that I don't know about, they're in the wrong job. And it's the collators, the intelligence systems job to feed that. So everything David's talking about, you can see, Mark, how those foundations are what took hold and make made the intelligence systems that we knew, I don't mean today, to be some of the best and most robust in the world. And I've certainly gone around the world teaching and establishing those same systems. I've never yet found it to be wrong. It's just uncomfortable. But then I'm a troublesome priest.
Howard, that's really important. I think it's an important point to reflect on, which is what struck me when I was speaking to David off air and just into our research into this podcast is called The Collators because you and I both felt that there was a criminal lack of historical recognition of the work of collators. Obviously, this is an audio-only podcast, but you can see me on camera. I have 2 rows of history books behind me, all about the UK Police Service. And I think of the dozens of books that sit behind me, I think there's only 1 or 2 that only have a brief footnote to the collators. And I think that the problem is that what a lot of, I think even within our own services that's not recognised is the Collators Office. And I'm not saying coppers didn't do this before the collators. I know there were proactive bobbies long before the collators. I get that. But I think the Collators Office was a crystallisation of basically that proactive intelligence function, whereby a lot of non-police listeners might not realise, but essentially some crimes do scream out and they demand attention. They're crises and everybody sees them, many witnesses, many victims, and society reacts. But a great many crimes do not attract attention, and sometimes they're very hard to detect. You have to have law enforcement personnel basically digging through metric tons of apparently useless information to get those leads. David mentioned about retaining photos, mentioned about other records, just in case something might happen. You mentioned the just in case box, how about for intel? And it's because sometimes a kidnapping or a murder or some other heinous crime can only be solved by the collection of such material. And sometimes it can only be solved by somebody who, and I want to touch on the point, I know I've talked about how adversarial and hostile the service was. You two have both met, or shall we say, spoke about that kind of tension between uniform and branch and CID. For our non-police listeners, that's essentially boils down to a bit of a tension between, well, I'll tell you, do either of you two want to try and explain the tension between uniform and CID?
I'll have a go. But I never really found there was a tension between the two. Now and again, you would get, I can remember a PC that I worked with. He was a young PC on my relief, and he got into the department fairly quickly. And I can remember him coming back on night duty. He was night duty CID, and he came into the station office at Bow Street and spoke to a sergeant there who had a crime sheet that he wanted to show this young detective. And the young detective, who I knew and I'd played football with, threw it back at the sergeant and gave him a right rollicking about how poor this was. And I said to him, "Oi, Peter, behave yourself." And it was simply because he'd been a uniform officer and now he was CID, and we were all, what did they used to call it? Wooden tops. That's what they used to call us in the Met. And I said, "Oh, you're out of order here, mate. I remember you from way back." And you got that from time to time, but I don't think there was ever a major problem with CID.
Sorry, what I meant was when I'm talking about the tension between, I've probably overstated it. What I mean is when I'm saying that you're having to fight for people's attention, or Howard's talking about like our experiences between the force intel and regional intel, is that I suppose it's important to recognise that everybody's got a day job, right? Everybody is overworked. Everybody is they have lots of competing priorities. And because everybody's books are full, you've got to kind of penetrate that and pierce that. And the techniques to try and pierce that are kind of tricky. But I think sometimes there has been a little bit of a uniform, as in, I think in both your example and one of Howard's examples where, somebody from above has gone, "What's all this about?" Actually, it's not in our recognised list of priorities, but give it a week or two and then suddenly it is. Sorry, Howard, I didn't mean to cut you off then, sorry.
Yeah, I think I agree with David. I mean, there was always, the nature of policing, the culture is one of at least friendly competition. And it's a bit like football supporters without it becoming violent. You wind each other up. I follow Formula One, so I'm the same, I follow the guy, not the team, but we're all the same. You separate into groups because that allows you to poke fun at the other group and think that you're different. Now, if you've got a sense of humour, it's only meant in fun to kind of make the day and whatever, and you give as good as you receive, you're quite happy to be made fun of as well, then it can be a healthy environment. It promotes camaraderie, in my view. The ones who made it bad were the ones who felt that they couldn't stand on their own personal ability or skill set or reputation and had to hide behind a title. It's like hiding behind a uniform. A uniform has purpose, but it can have a very negative purpose as well when it kind of masks you, the human being, from interacting with people. Don't look at me, look at the uniform. We've seen some of the worst atrocities committed by people in uniform, just as we've seen some of the best, most human work done by people in uniforms. Think of doctors with white coats. Think of nuns going around the world in nuns' clothes, feeding starving children. I'm picking either end there. I've never met an officer worthy of their salt or a civilian worthy of their salt that would hide behind, I'm a member of this team. And it wasn't just uniform and CID. I was in a hierarchy in CID that went from division up through serious and organised crime to terrorism and special branch, and each one of those groups felt that they were better or different to the other group. In uniform, the difference between a uniform beat officer, road traffic, I've learned to drive a car, or I'm a motorway car driver, so I wear a flat cap. It was just another status symbol. And if they had to hide behind it, they're just lesser people. But I would say, I was very lucky. For a fat bloke from Wakefield in West Yorkshire, in 34 years, my career took me all around the world. And I've worked with the best and the worst in police forces and law enforcement organisations around the world. And with all that experience and meeting some of these great people, the best police officer I ever worked with was a community constable in the village of Horbury in Wakefield, who was the old beat copper when I was a probationary. He wasn't my tutor, but I got put with this guy one day. And like David, I spent my time footwalking with pride and checking door handles and establishing myself. And when I joined the police, I had a degree. I didn't join as a graduate entrant. I don't believe in that. Even though I have trained graduate entrants, I believe policing is a career that requires far more than just a piece of paper. It's about dealing with human beings, people, both other colleagues and the public. But I can remember going out with this guy the first time and him saying to me, "You've got a degree?" "Yes." And he says, "Well, do you know what I've got, schooling-wise?" "No." He says, "Nothing." He says, "I left school at 14 and I was a cowman." He worked with cows on a farm, and then, just like David, he joined the police because he wanted a home, and community men got a community house then, rent-free. He wanted a stable career and a pension to be a husband and a father and everything else. But the reason I say that man was the best police officer I've ever worked with, in all the time that I knew him, and he was around for about 20 years of the early part of my career, and I'd long moved on from my post then and working with him. He was the community officer for this area. I never once remember him arresting a single person. Not one. But he knew everybody. He wasn't referred to as PC X. He was Mr. X. He would police because everybody told him everything, and he would deal with it without the need to arrest. And I can remember a chief inspector coming in to take over the division, who was a complete peacock. He was going to come in and make a name for himself. And he went to see this PC and he went to the local police station and had the PC come in and says, "You're a disgrace. I've looked at your records. You haven't arrested anybody for years." And my colleague John says, "Yeah, but can I just ask you, have you checked the crime figures and the incident reports for my area that I cover?" "Well, why would I need to do that? Arrest shows how good you are as a police officer." It's in the days when we had blood sheets, as they call them, the number of arrests or summonses we issued, people that were reported for offences. And he says, "Mine's consistently the lowest of any of the divisions, and it has been since the day I took this job." So the chief inspector, "That doesn't matter." Within an hour, and my colleague was very respectful, within an hour, that chief inspector had received phone calls from the chair of the local magistrates, from the Metropolitan County Council leader who lived in Horbury, and from the chief constable and from his divisional commander saying, "You will leave him alone. He is our community constable." And the chief inspector was moved within 3 days to a different post. So for me, if you think about the function of policing is using information to exert power to influence our society for the good of everybody. He was doing that all day long and every day long. He wasn't insulting people. He helped people with what you might call social issues like housing or income or minor theft. You know, people commit crime for many, many reasons, not all of which is, I want to be a career criminal and I'm a bad person. Like David was talking about the World War II veterans. I remember we had one in Wakefield, a vagrant, who was actually from the First World War. He was known as Corporal Manley. He walked around in a World War I overcoat and he had a wooden leg. And that man was a gentleman. And I have arrested him more times than probably anybody else for breach of the peace to give him a night in the cells and a breakfast. So he had a warm bed, and I would do that today. The police service wouldn't allow me to do that today, but that was me helping society. And that's what John was. So don't tell me about being elitist. It's a fiction.
I always say you always know when someone's from Yorkshire because they'll tell you. But we had at Bow Street, we had an ex-RAF, tail gun Charlie, known as Yorkie. Frank Brooksbank, his name was. I suppose that sounds a bit Yorkshire anyway. And he was a pain in the arse because he used to come into the station every night, and you probably know about the white lights outside Bow Street Police Station. There's a story about that, which is a load of nonsense. But he used to come in, hey, lads, can I turn lights on? And he would turn the lights on, and he'd bring us a newspaper, which he'd picked up from somewhere else, and handed it in. And he used to get nicked regularly for drunkenness, and he'd come in and, have a night's sleep and a breakfast in the morning. And it was just as I took over as collator, it was about 1982, and I got a phone call from, I think it was Potter's Bar in Hertfordshire. It was the middle of winter. And they said, we've got a dead body. He's been found in the car park, sleeping in the back of a car. And he's got a bail slip on from Bow Street Magistrates Court. And his name is Frank Brooksbank. I said, oh, that's Yorkie. Yeah, we all know Yorkie. Anyway, he was such a character that our local inspector on my relief, Lieutenant Alan Turner, he rang the RAF and arranged for a proper service and funeral for a bloke. That was something. And in recent years, I've reflected on that because I nicked hundreds of drunks, migrants in my early career as a probationer, like you had to do. And now you think, these poor old sods went through the Second World War and all sorts of other things. And, they had no support whatsoever when they came out. And we see that it's so different these days. And I reflect on, I think, poor old sods, we just used to nick them because they were a bloody nuisance. But not having realised at that time what sort of life they'd gone through.
But we gave them a bed. We'd have these people, I can remember in the cells, they would be given a bed, a cell. The door wasn't locked. And I can remember Corporal Manley, he'd be making tea for the custody staff. He'd be up and down, sweeping up. He'd be washing up. Typical ex-military. His cell was like an army barracks bed. It was folded. He was neat. The man was really well spoken. I think he'd been an officer in World War I, although they called him Corporal Manley. He had that kind of plum accent of, shall we say, a private education back, that kind of civil service accent back in the day. Very well spoken. And the nicest fella, he'd never talk about his war service. He was just living his life in a world that didn't have a place for him. And I've always thought of the police as one of our roles has to be to knock the rough edges off the reality of the world. If we can help somebody, we can, even though helping might mean sending them to prison because they need to go to prison to protect everybody else and themselves from themselves.
Yeah, but talking about the cells at Bow Street, we had 20 cells, and on a Friday and Saturday, they were all full up and sometimes doubled up. So we couldn't have cell doors open so that people could take orders for cups of tea and stuff. So it was a little bit different. We were an incredibly busy station on a weekend.
Well, I mean, that goes back a little bit when Howard, and I think was being too generous when he talked about the Intel products because when I worked for Howard's team, I was very new to Intel. I'd only had one Intel role prior to that. And my previous DI, I'd basically come from uni and I didn't really know anything from anything, to be fair. And one of the first jobs I got was writing pre-drug bust warrants, like the intel packages, saying this is what you should know about the premises, these who lives here, these who lives next door. That was my job. And my first attempts at it were rubbish. They were utterly, I was kind of like verbatim copying and pasting every bit of intel you could imagine. So you were going to do a warrant at a particular house in the middle of Bradford, and I'm giving you, 20 pages of dross, if you like. And he pulled me into the office one day and basically said, Mark, I know you mean well. I said, yes, you are right. This is everything we have on the systems on record about these houses and these people. But none of my officers are going to read all this. Okay. So you've got to bear in mind, when we hit this place tomorrow, you're dealing with a squad room of 10 detectives. Some are going through divorces. Some may have had a bit too much to drink the night before. Some, might be a bit distracted. They've got a caseload up to here. You've got a small aperture to get through. They need to know the stuff they need to know. Every single word on that page has to earn itself to be there. And so I kind of went from giving them the kitchen sink of everything to trying to make it, okay, I'll stick to the firearms risks. I'll stick to the dogs. I'll stick to the, people with violent history against police who live either side of the property or some stuff like that. The absolute headline stuff, almost like a journalistic faction, really editing that stuff. And it goes back to what you're saying about your kind of international fraudster headline. Is that it's that aperture, because people are overworked, are human beings. Something that struck me about what you both said. When you talk about people who've ex-soldiers on the streets, and that's something that UK media's kind of missed, because we don't see a lot of that. And I don't think we've seen that in recent years, that kind of reflection of we've got a lot of, it's usually an American trope, isn't it? It's usually the Vietnam vet, or maybe the first Desert Storm vet. We don't, when Howard's talking about his experiences of veterans, you're speaking your experience of veterans, it's quite sobering to think, no, actually, Britain had let its vets down. And not just, you're talking from London, and Howard's talking as far away as a small town near Leeds. It's kind of sobering to think that, we perhaps let our vets down. Oh, no, perhaps about it. We did let our vets down. But the other point is, when you ask people, what is a police officer for, or what they should do, both of you have reflected that actually, yes, a lot of your job was about locking up villains, but a lot of your job was about almost that kind of social work, you're performing a societal function. You're the last safety net, potentially, before something else. And Howard also opened the door on something that I might want to talk to you about if you're both happy, which is, I would call it discretion. So you're both operational police officers of many years. Howard's example of his former colleague who didn't arrest many people very often. I'm just wondering, Dave, do you have a take on discretion? Because you were an operational police officer before you became a lawyer for many years. So in terms of discretion, do you have any view or take on that, about the decision not to arrest, to kind of let people go?
Whoa, blimey.
I am known for dropping big questions on people. I'm sorry, I do it to Howard all the time.
From our point of view, C Division, as I say, covered Soho, Oxford Street, Park Lane, and the Bow Streets ground. We were all young coppers. You were sent out of training school at 19, and very few blokes would come into C Division from other places or other ages. They would all be 19 or 20 and living in section houses, we called them. Trenchard House was a big place, a couple of hundred single men, all about 1920, living right in the middle of Soho with all the attractions that were there.
Expertly put.
Yes, a lot of attractions and some smashing curry houses, but that's by the way. And I think at that stage, I lived in North London and I hadn't got a clue what was what. And so it was instilled into you when you first started, you needed to arrest people. You'd nick people for drunks, insulting behaviour, whatever. The idea was you nick people, nicked them. It was only when you got a bit older that you perhaps looked at these people and thought, well, I don't know. I can't really remember too many occasions when I gave people advice and told them to go away, and if they didn't go away, you'd nick them anyway. But, I think it's something that you perhaps learned as you went on. I mean, I can remember, I think there's only one time when I perhaps regretted nicking a bloke. It was in Trafalgar Square. He was in a suit and a briefcase. He was drunk and he was soaking wet up to his waist and he was shouting and hollering. And anyway, I nicked him in the end because he was a bloody nuisance. And when I got him into the charge room, I said, what the hell's the matter with you? He said, I've just been to my best mate's funeral. And for a moment you thought, God, I shouldn't have really brought him in, but, you couldn't do much about it. But I did feel a pang when he told me that, because we've all been there.
I think that's the thing, though, isn't it? I think that people think that the policing is quite binary. If you're guilty of an offence, that person should be arrested and dealt with. But there are sometimes sets of circumstances where perhaps it's not the best thing to do. It's probably not the best use of taxpayer resources. It's probably not the best use of time. So there might be technical breaches, but maybe the difficulties. I mean, Howard, have you got a view on discretion or?
I've got loads of views. I mean, I'm the troublesome priest that was teaching 3,000 national new recruit police officers about discretion versus what the National Police Training College was churning out, because I was teaching it from the reality point of view rather than book learning. And it's all very well to talk about discretion in a classroom with 30 people and no life experience, like David's saying. When you're 17, 18, 19 and it's 3:30 and on a rainy night down some dark alley and you can't get radio reception, or you're on your own and there's 30 odd people or somebody with privilege telling them that they know the chief constable or somebody and they're going to ruin your career. It's a hell of a thing to actually stand by your principles or the job that you're expected to do, or conversely to say, I'm not going to do that. Making the arrest might be the easy way. And I've known police officers who've gone through their service saying, I don't make the law. I'm just going to apply the law strictly. Speed limit. You're doing 71 in a 70, you're getting done. Can't argue with that because that's the law. And I'm sure they had a fairly easy time with their decision making. Nobody's going to challenge them because it's correct in law. But I'm not sure about their overall contribution to society. And my use of discretion has led me to gain far more for society to gain far more than it's lost. And I don't mean about covering things up. That's not the issue at all. It's about skillfully, like any skillful profession, there are rules and processes. And you can apply those rules and processes, even black and white ones, but together they form grey. So you can work your way through a certain decision tree to come up with the right outcome, when actually the easy outcome would have been arrest, but without it being one where you've let somebody off. Even the police services recognise that with things like antisocial behaviour orders, the caution, formal cautions and all this business. Over the years, there have been many processes designed to avoid the actually very costly and time ineffective process of arresting people and putting them before a court, because other processes and other interests, including politics and prison space and, societal opinion, other agencies vested personal interests like the CPS when that took a role. They've all had to have a fact, even if you've made the arrest, I'm quite happy to stand by what I did. But if it fails at court or CPS or somebody refused to process a charge or they're found not guilty or it's thrown out at court, that's outside my control. Provided I've done my job in collecting as fairly as possible, presenting the evidence, I have to accept that. It's called justice. You aren't judge and jury. You're just a collector of facts and a collector of people to be judged against those facts.
A collator even.
Yeah, you're a collator of people, not of information. I will confess, on one occasion, I didn't arrest somebody that I should have done. It was very early in my service. I was literally days into my probation, and I got faced with a situation where, to this day, I don't know whether they were guilty of something, but I had a power to make an arrest of somebody in public, another police officer, as it turned out, and I didn't. And I came away from that because I'm a reflective person. I bottled it, and I went back and spoke to my sergeant, who was a real tartar, but he had a heart of gold. He was my mentor in those days. And he said, look, never put your job and your livelihood at risk for somebody else who's done something stupid. And I carried that through a 34-year police career. So much so, I never fell for that again. And at the end of my career, I ended up challenging very senior officers in the force for misconduct issues. And I was a company man. I was always a company man, the troublesome priest. I knew where all the skeletons were buried, or a lot of them, and was always there to help my organisation and my colleagues get themselves and society out of the, the brown stuff. But at the end, I had to stand by my principles, and it cost me, but I have no complaint. And that all came from doing the wrong thing once. So I think it makes me imperfect, which I certainly am, and a bit of a hypocrite. But I would say that minor incident had such an effect on me, it brought me back onto what you might call a straight and narrow in terms of ethics and honesty and integrity in my job, that stood me in very good stead in far more complex and impactful roles that I took on throughout the rest of my career. Does that kind of make sense? I've told you there were police officers who I would not trust near my wife, near my baby son, in my house. And there are criminals. I have serious organised criminals that I have put away for long prison sentences, including multiple life sentences, that I would have trusted with my baby son, my wife, and in my house. They might be murderers, but they were not, I can't say they're not bad people, but they were not a threat. They had integrity and honesty.
In a way trustworthy.
In a way that made them trustworthy. And that's my point. Folk are folk. Take the uniform off a police officer, it's just a bloke or a woman from round the corner with a problematic task to deal with on behalf of society.
And I think that emphasis on police being human is why the Collators Office, and maybe Dave's got a view on this, why the Collator as a person or the Collators as a team, maybe something got lost along the way. Because as we brought, Dave, you obviously moved into the methods side of things and saw computerization and digitization of records. Howard, you've a similar thing. You've seen the digitization. But I think the thing that I find the most appealing, the most romantic about the Collator as a role is that you've got the reactive side. Officers could come into the office and say, Dave, what do you know about this lad? Or blah, blah, blah. And then you have a human interaction. So yes, maybe in a few years we'll have an AI and you say, what do you know about this lad? And maybe the AI will bring something. But I have a feeling that something will still be not quite right. I think David will, for instance, he'll know he's talked to another officer 2 weeks ago about something else, or he'll have overheard a conversation somewhere. So I wonder if maybe, Dave, is there anything about the Collator role or the Collators Office that maybe we've not spoke about, or something that you think is worth mentioning?
Oh, quite a lot, really. I'll just tell you, I don't know whether this is similar to what you were just talking about. I had, at one stage, I had a young PC, come into the office, and he said to me, Dave, can I have a word? So I went outside, and this was at a certain stage some while ago, when I said, what is it, mate? And he said, I didn't want to say this too loud, he said, because everyone's going to laugh. I said, go on then. He said, I think I've just seen Lord Lucan. So I stifled a laugh. So I said, go on, tell me about it. And he'd seen Lord Lucan on the tube. And I had made some inquiries. I rang the local station, which was, I think it was Rochester Row or Gerald Road, where the murder had taken place. And they said, no, you'll have to ring the murder office at the yard and blah, blah, blah. I wasn't getting anywhere where anyone could say, tell us about it. So I went up and saw one of my detective inspectors, the young detective inspector. I said, I've got a PC downstairs. He says he's seen Lord Lucan. I'll leave that with me. But the thing about that, and it turned out years later that probably Lord Lucan was back in London at that time. There's a good case to be made for it. Anyway, the thing about that was this young PC, who I didn't know very well, the only person he thought he could talk to was me. He couldn't go to his sergeant or his inspector. He said, I thought you were the only one who I could trust who wouldn't take the piss out of me. So I said, well, that's very nice. I'm pleased. I must have made a bit of an impression on a young PC, and I was pleased with that.
I think that's gold, because everything we've talked about so far has been how the collators, the intelligence or the information systems, just passively collect what comes in and file it and organise it and then share it out in some entertaining way where if they find something significant. But I think the role is more than that, because the system only works if people put information in.
Absolutely.
So you've got to encourage people that putting information in, even if it seems like stupid or irrelevant, or it's going to get you castigated or laughed at, do it. And somebody will support you. In this case, the collator will support you in that. even if you end up anonymizing it to protect an officer. I have that before now quite readily. The second thing is, and we don't get chance to do this as much as we should or could, correct information by going back to the source and saying, you've said apples are apples. Well, have you thought that apples might be pears? Whatever the issue is, just to clarify what they're putting in. And I'll give you a really good example of this. One of the cause célèbres for failed investigations is the Yorkshire Ripper, a series of sex working ladies being attacked and killed in lifetime whilst it's being investigated. So it's a series of crimes. I know some of the detectives who led that inquiry, and some of the best forces finest of that time. I won't stand by and see them denigrated. Did they fail? Yes. Does that mean they're crap detectives? No, absolutely not. But one of the things you mentioned right back at the beginning, Dave, was the old NIBs. And in my day, the NIB form, which I can never remember whether it's National Information Bulletin or National Intelligence Bulletin, the NIB, what it stood for. Can you remember? I can't. Anyway, the number of the form was an NIB 74.
Oh, CRO 74. That was my favourite form ever.
Yeah. This, just so that the members of the public know, this was the piece of paper filled in by a host force that was fed into a national database. So this was the pot of data that went to create a national picture in Dave's office. Gold dust. And I remember during and after the inquiry into the Yorkshire Ripper, because obviously several homicides took place before Peter Sutcliffe was caught, and he wasn't caught by the investigation team. He was caught by two traffic officers doing a routine stop, like Dave talks about, pulling people walking around his local area, stop and search. These coppers just pulled a car on a night time and they got a result, and fair play, good old-fashioned coppering. But what had happened when people look, well, how is it the investigation team missed it? Peter Sutcliffe had been notified or come to the attention of the police and the inquiry team many times. But one of the offences, his MO of killing the working girls was to approach them as a potential customer, get them into a compromising position, and then he would beat them, usually to death, with a claw hammer. One of the girls didn't actually die, but of the ones he was caught and convicted of, and that's a different story, that was his MO, his modus operandi. When he had come into the system, somewhere in the north of England, for a previous offence, he had attacked a sex worker with a claw hammer. So you'd think, well, if you put that into a national index, that would show up. No, it didn't. The reason being, the officer who filled that form in, this human being, the fields of this form were quite complex, but there was a small part which was free text for the MO, the modus operandi. What's the crime about? And that's really potentially the most important bit, because it's free text. That's where you get to tell the story. And you could have written anything in there, not chapter and verse, but quite a detailed explanation to explain what makes this MO different or unique. And all that had been written were 5 words. Man assaults woman with hammer. Nothing wrong with that. Technically, it's correct. But how many other instances, think about domestic violence, where partners attack each other with weapons? It didn't spring out that the woman, it didn't mention that the woman had to be a sex worker. It didn't mention that the man had found the victim by looking for sex workers. It could have been any assault. And therefore, that poor entry, no matter the great work of the Met and the CRO system, the great work of the collators and the intelligence teams collating and coordinating these indices so you can search for them, you can't pull information out of a system that's not there. It's like a fishing net where the holes in the fishing net are too big for the little things you're trying to catch.
I could speak for days about the CRO 74. It was one of my favourite subjects.
No. The only final point I was going to make was, in my world, I wish, and this isn't something for the central office that you worked in my home force, I wish that the local collator, because these things were collated locally before they were sent in nationally, who had checked that form as one of hundreds going across their desk periodically, had thought to say, hang on a minute, can't you be a bit more specific on your MO here? It's exactly like misspelling a name or getting a reference number wrong. that carelessness can completely derail the best system and the best intel in the world. And that was the issue for me. So everything you talk about, Dave, I agree with. Part of the collator's job is not only to encourage and make a safe space for people to put information in, but make sure what they're putting in is in a form that's of value and it gives clarity.
One of the things, when I was an area car driver, there used to be, to start with, we had an area car driver who was in charge of the crew, if you like, who was the older PC, and a radio operator and a plainclothes observer in the back. And so when you arrested someone, you all did certain jobs. And I, as the driver, I wasn't the one who was going to be taking the bloke to court. So I would select to do the CRO 74, the fingerprints and the photograph. And I made those my own. And the CRO 74, and I've seen this so many times, you would have to have the prisoner in front of you while you are filling that form in, because you've got a whole description of the bloke, marks, scars, tattoos, the lot. And I'd seen so many blokes say, I'll put the bloke down the cell now and we'll do the 74. And you cannot do a CRO 74 description form if the bloke's in the cell. You don't even know what colour his eyes are, for a start. Look, what I used to do, in the end, what I would do, and I always try to do this, I didn't want to antagonise any prisoner. I didn't see the point, because you could get so much out of them if you were just reasonable. And I would get them in conversation. I played football a lot, so I can always remember some young lad that we nicked for a credit card. It was one of those where we took a call, credit card being tendered now in Oxford Street. So we got there and we knew that the bloke would have gone because he wouldn't have stood there and waited for the police to turn up. This fella was there. Young, big fella, and he realised he was getting nicked, so he fought like Billy-O. Anyway, we got him into the nick, and he calmed down, and I got in conversation with him about this, that, and the other. I started talking about football. You talk about anything just to get these bits and pieces out of them. I said, where do you play? Oh, he said, I play centre half. I said, oh, right, okay. But who do you play for? And all this was going down on the 74. I thought, I don't know whether this is going to be any use to anyone at all, but I'm putting this down. He plays centre half for this particular club, blah, blah, blah. And one of the things I always used to say to him, you've got to have what's your full name? And then I was always say, what do your mates call you? Because people wouldn't do that normally. You just say, oh, you've got to fill in his full name, but that's not what you want. If a bloke is known outside as Bomber, which one bloke was, you're never going to get that from him. He's going to say, my name's John Smith. Yeah. What do your mates call? Oh, they call me Bomber. So write that down. All that sort of stuff. And it all went down. And I thought, I don't know whether this is going to be of any use to anybody, but it's going in. And 74s, and when I went up to Method Index, the first thing you did, because every 74 in the country came through NIB and then into Method Index, and we would pick up a bunch like that. And for the first 20 minutes, you put it on your desk and you go like that and look for methods. And you go, we'll have that one, won't have that. 70 foots. And the times, when I was collator, I used to take the probationers into the charge room and say, this is a 74. And I'd turn around and I'd say, right, what colour are my eyes? And they said, have I got any marks on my face? Oh, I don't know. Oh, I've got a mole on my cheek there, look. And that should go down. You cannot do that if the prisoner is in the cell. You've got to have them in front of you. CRO 74. And the other thing was, you used to put down employment, unemployed. What about unemployed what? When you are working, what do you do? All it's detailed, isn't it, Howard?
Yeah. And that's music to my ears. But what it also does, I've always said the copper's greatest ability is the ability to communicate. And that's an example of it, the most important example, the collecting of information that otherwise you wouldn't get. There's no police power in the world or judicial system that's going to guarantee you that information. If somebody don't want to talk to you or they want to mess up what you're saying, you've got to meet them on their level. I always remember when I first started, we'd have the blood sheet, so many arrests or summons that you did that week. And to write something in that book, I can still remember underlining each one. You'd look at what all the officers before you had done and then what CID had done for the station. And you knew that when the DS or whoever came in that morning, they'd be looking through what the uniform had done for crime summonses and things like that. And I once got a rollicking. I got quite good at that. It was the start of what became my career in CID. And I got to talk to folk. And I remember having a guy in once, a young kid, about 14, 15, because we had, in the little station I was in, we had 2 cells, just a little branch station. And I was interviewing him. We didn't have interview rooms. This is pre-PACE. It was just an office about an offence. And he was effing and blinding, swearing. I was effing and blinding. And I had a far more experienced female colleague from a different team, uniform, who overheard this. And when he left, she was berating me, saying, "You're a police officer. You shouldn't be using language like that." And I mean, I'd come back. I'm only a working stiff, but I'd come from a university. She said, you had a university background. You're a graduate. What are you doing talking to him like that? I said, well, that's his preferred way of communicating. If me speaking to him like that gets him to open up, I'm going to get information out of him that you're not. And I can always remember the next morning when the incident book was filled in with all the offences that I'd charged and reported him for. Some were charges, some were report for summons. It was like a full page, and she read it, and I said, there. I got that out of him because I talked to him in a way that he wanted to talk to. I wouldn't go home and talk to my mum or my dad or my wife or my baby son like that. But it's about communication.
You've reminded me of a WPC we had, and she didn't know how to talk to people at all. That's the way she was. And we used to say, "Linda, please, just calm it down a little bit. Talk to him nicely."
So, David, is there anything that we've missed?
As I said to you yesterday, I'll talk for days on this subject. There'll always be something that comes up that you can think of.
Well, you could always come back.
All right.
So I think if you will come back again, maybe we'll revisit this. And I can't thank you enough for talking to both me and Howard. Howard, is there anything you want to say before we wind things up?
Dave, it's been a pleasure. Great to make contact, mate.
Well, I hope you've enjoyed today. I know I have.